So hello and very welcome to this ESCom event.
Hutton Institute in Aberdeen. So thank you to all those who've come from Edinburgh, and thank you to all those who come from further afield. James Hutton has been a founder member of the ESCom community since it started 3 years ago, and I'm really passionate about the way Mark described what ESCom is set up to do, and I thought tonight's panel event would be a really good way of bringing together interests to take stock and think about how we might move forward. My role at James Hutton is to coordinate a work package on the sustainable and integrated management of natural assets. And I personally am very interested in how we govern and manage our environment. We're very honoured today to have two international scientists visiting the James Hutton Institute as a guest of the Macaulay Development Trust. I'm sure you can guess which two of the panel they are. If you don't know, it's Bob Costanza and his colleague Ida Kubiszewski. In order to make the most of their visit, they're giving the Macaulay lecture tomorrow night. Quick plug, that's at the Dynamic Earth here in Edinburgh at 5 o'clock. If anyone would like a ticket, please see me because it is invite only. I think it was full, but if anyone's desperate to go and see it, please come and see me. I'll see what I can do for you. Anyway, to make the most of their visit, we thought we'd also arrange this event because it's much more informal than tomorrow night's lecture, and I think it really reflects the ethos of what ESCom is set up to do. I think when I introduce the panel, you'll see that there are a really nice range of different perspectives on the idea of ecosystem services and natural capital. We have academics, we have people from policy and practice, we have people who've been working in it for a very long time, and people who are maybe coming to it maybe from a different angle or a little bit more critical or questioning. Also, I hope you in the audience will give us some difficult questions to ponder. But the point of tonight, or where the panel are going to take off from in just a moment, is that over 600 people came together last month in Antwerp for a conference organised by a partnership. It was a conference on the European ecosystem services, and it was subtitled Helping Nature to Help Us. It was a way on reflecting on what was happening with ecosystem services in academia and in practice. We had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. Here in the UK, we have the National Ecosystem Assessment in 2011. There's been a burgeoning amount of work done since then. But people are saying, well, where are we going with this? And what is the point? So the result of this conference was the Antwerp Declaration, which is there. Everyone should have a copy on their chair. If you haven't got a copy, please ask your neighbour if they'll share. And the declaration was really asking us to reflect on the transformative potential of ecosystem services. Whether you agree with it or not, I thought it was a really nice point to ask the panel to reflect on. So the title I'm asking the panel to respond to is what has the concept of the ecosystem services done for us? So you don't need to reflect on the Antwerp Declaration, panel members, before you panic. Necessarily, just more broadly, what has the concept of ecosystem services done for us? So I'll introduce each speaker in turn. I'll ask them to respond to that provocation for about 5 minutes. Once everyone's spoken, I hand over to Mark, and he will chair the Q&A. We hope to finish at about 6:30, and we'll move into the atrium for drinks and more informal discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. This is Ida. So Ida has come from Australia, well not today, she's come from York today, but from Australia more generally. Ida is a senior lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University in Canberra. She has a lot of experience in writing and publishing about earth sciences, climate change, its natural environment, and interactions with society. I think it's really interesting that her role she's played in putting together a number of publications like the Encyclopedia of Earth, she edits the Ecological and Economics Review, and also together with Bob Costanza, this journal, which some of you might have seen on the front page. They're not to take away, I'm afraid, but if you'd like to have a look, Solutions is a very innovative journal that's trying to cross the academic practice divide. So without further ado, Ida, how would you like to respond?
Thank you. So just about Solutions. Solutions is freely available online, so you can access all the stories at thesolutionsjournal.com. And we did have an ecosystem ecosystem services issue about 3 years ago, so you could take a look at that. As a first speaker, I was going to sort of give a broad overview what's going on the international scene, and just, I guess I didn't know where the audience was coming from and what the level was, so just go quick background. So ecosystem services has been getting a lot of attention, not only in sort of the academic field, where if you look at the number of papers, it's been going up exponentially over the last 10 years. So it's growing quickly, and it's also growing quickly in policy. The term ecosystem services is being used more and more with policymakers, etc. And it's being used for various reasons. So the basic is to raise awareness. The idea that ecosystem services exist, they are valued. If you don't put a value on them, often they're assumed to be zero. The value is assumed to be zero. So it's used as awareness. It's starting to be used for national accounts as well. And I'll go into a few examples of that. For policy analysis, to look at how good the policy is, will it actually have negative impacts? Land use planning. A lot of places are looking at ecosystem services for land use planning. For example, in Oregon, the city of Portland and that region has land use boundaries that they define through watersheds, through ecosystem services. Payment for ecosystem services has also been becoming quite popular. Costa Rica, for example, has had a payment for ecosystem service scheme going for a decade or so now. And full cost accounting on items. And that's starting to become really important as well. So, for example, in the US, when buildings are being built, they're often in the sort of LEED standard, and ecosystem services are used for that. There was, out of France, there was a challenge around buildings called the Living Building Challenge. And so there's been a lot of work done around if you have zero water and zero energy usage by a building net, what does that mean for ecosystem services long term, and what the value is of that building versus a traditional building. So there's been a lot of work, and for various reasons. An important thing to remember too about ecosystem services is that they contribute to well-being, but they don't contribute alone to well-being. So there are other capitals as well out there, and they combine with the other capitals to sort of promote well-being and increase well-being. So human, social, natural, and built. And so there has to be that combination of these various capitals, and ecosystem services sort of is the output of natural capital. So keeping in mind there is that whole system. We did a study, well, Bob did a study in 1997, many of you probably heard of it, which found that ecosystem services globally were worth about $33 trillion. And then a group of us redid that study recently and found that they were now worth about 145 trillion. A lot of that was due to just more knowledge, knowing how to value those services, etc. We've reassessed it, and we looked into the future. So we recently did an assessment looking at if you had to do 4 futures, 4 scenarios going into future, and you build a model depending on what sort of decisions were made into the future, what would global ecosystem services look like going forward? And we found that depending on the decisions we made globally, they could decrease significantly or increase quite a bit too. So anywhere between a loss of about 60 to 70 trillion dollars to a gain of about 30 to 40. So that's ongoing work, but looking at scenario planning as aligned with ecosystem services. There's also been a lot of individual sort of projects. So ESP, the Ecosystem Service Partnership, was mentioned, where they had the conference a few weeks ago. But then there's the International Society as well. IPBS, which is sort of like the IPCC for ecosystem services, has also a large part of the community involved. But then there's things like the Obama. So Obama about 3 years ago, released a memo saying that every department and organization under the government in US had to consider ecosystem services before they made any decisions. And so that's actually really big, because that includes the Treasury Department. That includes any buildings being built by government. That includes anything that government does. Ecosystem services now have to be considered when making decisions. How that's being implemented, well, it's a work in progress, right? So we spoke with the chief economist at NOAA, and she said that it's starting a lot there. Basically what it does is those people that want to incorporate ecosystem services into their decision making now have almost the permission to do it. Of course, those that don't, there's a way around it, as with every other policy and memo. But it is starting to grow. There's the UNCIA, so it's a national accounts that were developed by the UN to incorporate ecosystem services into country accounts. And the World Bank is now working with about 10 countries around the world to start incorporating those into the national account. And on the business side, a company called TrueCost, for example, is working with other companies to look at full cost accounting of their products. So they did a big report about a year ago now. They worked with Puma to look at what the ecosystem service value of their shoes were, and how they can reduce that impact. So this idea is spreading within all areas. One way we're looking to go forward with this is looking at the idea of how do you actually have the general public start understanding ecosystem services, start understanding priorities, start understanding the importance. And we're looking at games and how games can help with that. So there's a statistic that the human race spends about 3 billion hours a week playing games. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of resources. So if we could take just a small portion of that and make them learn something while they're playing those games. So how do you develop those games that are fun, are educational, but we could also do research about how people prioritize and what people prioritize in the background. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great and perfectly on time. I'm now going to... So Bruce, the microphone. That's great. Mark is going to get some slides up. So, Bruce Wilson is the Senior Policy Officer at Scottish Wildlife Trust, and he has many hats, including he is on the Agriculture and Environment Working Group of the Scottish Environment Link. He oversees the Secretariat for the Scottish Forum of Natural Capital, but I think very pertinent to tonight's panel is he had a key role in organising the World Natural Capital Forum back in 2015. And I'm going to invite Bruce now to respond to my provocation.
Thanks very much. So on the hoof, I'm going to slightly rewrite my presentation, but don't worry, I decided to go down a slightly more Scottish context with this and try and talk about it not from a World Forum of Natural Capital point of view, but more from a Scottish Wildlife Trust point of view on the ground in Scotland as a kind of medium-sized NGO with about 40,000 members and a network of 120 reserves across Scotland. What does this concept of ecosystem services and the associated language of natural capital really mean for us? Well, it is about that. It's about language and it's about communication. For me, working on the policy side of things, I've really got to keep in mind that not everyone has the same passions, motivations, drivers as people like me, people that work for my organisation, lots of other people around the world that want to protect and enhance the environment. Some people have gone, oh God, I've gone flown through, haven't I? Some people are really concerned for a variety of different reasons with other things, like making money, like producing food, all of these other things, these kind of competing interests. So the language of ecosystem services and natural capital allows us as an organisation, in some cases, to kind of have a a common language, a framework that's useful for discussing issues and coming up with opportunities and solutions in some cases as well. Would I use the language of natural capital and ecosystem services with this young lad out on one of our reserves here? Probably not. He's not really interested in cultural values. He might not. He is, but he doesn't realise it. He's more interested there in kind of finding out about creepy crawlies, having a bit of fun with our wildlife watch group. Similarly, I wouldn't use the language of natural capital with our members groups. Really, they more tend to be interested in the kind of intrinsic values, and they are just passionate about certain species, about their local reserves. Talking about provisioning services, probably not going to float their boat. Some of them, I had to say to Rebecca earlier, after I wrote this slide this morning, I got a phone call asking if I'd do a presentation to one of our members groups next week, specifically about natural capital and ecosystem services. So I'm going to have to eat my words slightly there. They are interested to a degree in the concepts behind that, but in general, it's the species and habitats they like. But I don't spend all my time with membership groups. I don't spend all my time with talking about wildlife with young people. Sometimes we've got to talk to special advisors from government. Sometimes we have meetings with stakeholders that are influenced by other factors. This is the only slide I could think of to symbolise a meeting. Because we just seem to drink an awful lot of cups of tea and try and thrash out solutions. I'm going to draw on an example from last week. The Scottish National Farmers Union convened a group called the Farm and Environment Forum, and we actually talked an awful lot about ecosystem services with that group, because we were trying to basically look at opportunities around Brexit and kind of what's going to happen now. We were trying to come up with some common lines and some common themes that all groups around that table could agree on, and what public money goes to pay for. The language of ecosystem services can be enormously helpful in that sort of situation. So just reflecting on the question, for the future, I'm really hopeful that this kind of this language can help us engage with the non-usual suspects and get them around the table, start trying to internalise some of the market externalities that are a problem for us at the moment. And with that specific example of what comes next after the Common Agricultural Policy, I think is a good one, and it's a real opportunity around that kind of language. The Scottish Wildlife Trust, obviously making sure that biodiversity and wildlife is properly accounted for, both within the kind of natural capital as the stock, and that flow of services, the ecosystem services, is really key, and we spend a lot of time getting involved in that, hence our involvement with the Royal Forum on Natural Capital, hence our involvement with the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital. So that's my kind of reflections on the question, and hopefully have a good session afterwards. I'm sorry,
Thank you very much, Bruce. And now I'm passing it actually to Maura. That's great. So we're passing from an NGO perspective on system services and natural capital to an industry perspective, albeit Maura Garden from the Scottish Whisky Association comes very much from the environmental aspect. But I first met Maura when she was on secondment working with Scottish Government on diffuse water pollution, and I have interacted with her on and off since then. But I'm very grateful that we have someone speaking here from an industry perspective, and perhaps saying how she personally or how her sector might respond to the provocation.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, I'd just like to say I'm speaking very much from myself. I do work in the Scottish Whisky Association, but these views are all my own. And secondly, I think we're probably very much in the learning from everybody else who are very much more experts in this area than myself. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to come along and speak here, or participate, is to really learn and start moving forward on this journey. So if I can just say really briefly, I'm Maura Garden, Head of Sustainability and Innovation at the Scottish Whisky Association. And just that the Scottish Whisky Association is a trade body for the Scottish whisky industry, We have around 60 members. This can go from Diageo, multinational, international company, through to Cahoman, which is a small distillery in Islay and privately owned. And we have to represent all their ideas and messages. And our overarching aim is to promote and protect the Scotch whisky category across the globe. Also, just that the Scotch, I think probably why the Scotch whisky industry got asked to come along is that we're a very important industry to Scotland, to the UK. We add 5 billion of value to the UK economy. We support 40,000 jobs across the UK, and talking about cultural capital, 1.6 million visitors visited the collective distilleries last year, and it's equivalent to the number of visitors that go to Edinburgh Castle. So we're quite a significant industry for Scotland. We're also quite an unusual sector in that our local environment is really important to us and our consumers. Our consumers have a strong appeal to the Scotch whisky, and our brands are based upon a pristine Scottish environment, and they have a really sense of place. Like I was talking to a member company earlier today, and we must be one of the few companies or sectors where our customers want to come and see where we produce our product. They want to visit the manufacturing site. They want to see where this product has come from. I don't know if you go to the BMW manufacturing car plant in Germany. So it's in Germany. And that strong consumer appeal and sense of place is one of the reasons why natural capital is important to us and why we're interested in it. So thank you. Yeah, so it's a relatively new concept for us, ecosystem services, and there's another one, natural capital. So if I went out and did a survey with my members, and can you give me in 100 characters or less what these mean? I'm not sure I'd be able to get them to give that clarity. We know that they're interconnected, but we maybe don't know the absolutes. And this is, as I say, I'm very much a novice on this concept compared to everybody else. As a business, we need to understand where it's going to give us value. It needs to be able to be part of our business decision-making process. It needs to not just give us another set of numbers. We're a very simple supply chain. The supply chain for the Scotch whisky industry is short and simple. We know where our risks are. We know where our environmental risks are. So whatever a natural capital or ecosystem services tool, it needs to be of benefit and add something to us. Because we've already kind of maybe gone away along this road, but using a different concept and terminology, which I'd say is the life cycle analysis. And that's something that our sectors have done, and so, as I say, these risks are understood. But even though I'm saying on one hand it's a new concept, it's not something that's completely unique to us or we've not experienced, because we've started on our journey already. We had James Hutton Institute who came in and gave us a presentation on ecosystem services, and one of the examples we got there was barley and barley breeds, and one barley breed can coexist better with a rare weed than another barley breed. I don't know if we want that weed, but we also worked with SEPA on a case study to do with ecosystem services, and within that case study what we looked at was our environmental strategy, which I've got copies of it today if anybody wants it. So we've recently refreshed our environmental strategy, and I think that really helps us think about our risks and our impacts on the environment and linking that back to ecosystem services. And all the kind of key themes within our strategy, packaging, water, energy, sustainable land use, they all interconnect with this natural capital and ecosystem services. And the work that SEPA did on a very kind of broad brush was saying overall our strategy really helps our sector have benefits and improve have positive ecosystem services. So so as I say, it's something that we understand a little. Well, we don't really understand it, but we understand the broader concept, and we want to be part of it. And this is kind of the start of that process to do this.
Thank you very much. Could we now pass the mic over to Alessandro? So we're swapping back now to a more academic perspective, or at least Alessandro Alessandro is an academic, I don't know what wants to speak about. Alessandro is a colleague of mine from the James Hutton Institute at Aberdeen. He's leading a piece of work on trade-offs to do with ecosystem services and natural capital within the work package that I'm coordinating. Alessandro is a member of the Ecosystem Service Partnership and has been dealing with these issues and themes for a very long time using integrated land use modelling and scenarios. So over to you, Alessandro.
Okay, thank you. So the question was, what have ecosystem services done so far, and what can they do for the future? And I think I would like to take a slight step back and think about the context in which they are deployed, so to speak. So to me, they can be a very exciting concept or a relatively ordinary concept according to what kind of economic framework we decide to adopt. So being a natural scientist and a geographer, I'm going to say something quite obvious for the natural scientist, i.e. that we need to remember that the physical frame is that we live on a finite planet, and therefore the human activities are essentially contained by the planet, and the economy is contained by the planet. So ecosystem services are essentially, the benefits that we can get from the ecosystems in the planet. But the question is, what is the right size of our economic activities? Economic activities, obviously, human activities in general, are essential, from some points of view, but also they deplete the natural capital and the ecosystem services that come from natural capital. So there is immediately a question of, what is the right size of our economy, and so ecosystem services have the advantage to put nature to the fore, in a sense, if we acknowledge this simple reality that is rooted in our ecological and physical knowledge. And although this is quite obvious, if you take a kind of neoclassical perspective, that might not be so obvious. So in practice, and so the economic models and the decisions that flow from them might not actually be completely taken into account. The fact that there is a finite planet and therefore a finite size of the economy. And so essentially the question then is, for us understanding as scientists, what is the scale of the economy that is actually compatible with human well-being, first and foremost, and then secondly, there is a slightly different question, which is an ethical question, i.e. What is then the size that we choose among the various possible answers, and at that point there are questions of also of distribution, essentially. How do we then, having accepted, if we do accept it, that we can't grow indefinitely, how do we then deal with the fact that we have essentially scarce natural resources, and the ecosystem services need to be protected, and so on and so forth, and how do we distribute this? So this is quite new from the, if you look at it from the point of view of a classical framework, but it's quite established in many quarters, both among economists and ecologists and policymakers, but it's not yet widespread. So depending on who you ask, and I think the situation is very patchy, in various different countries. And so from my perspective, ecosystem services can be a very exciting concept in this framework, are a bit less exciting if we simply say, well, they are a tool to just internalize externalities, and instead of making decisions regarding the scale of the economy, distribution, and so on, we completely leave it to the market to sort it out. In that case, they are possibly a way to incorporate natural signals into the market, but are probably a bit less revolutionary in terms of what kind of policy we choose to implement. That's it.
If you could pass the mic to Becky Badger. I've got some slides actually. Great. So Becky Badger works for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. She's travelled down from the Highlands to be with us today. Thank you, Becky. And Becky, willingly, she does a great job as a single person, helping bring ecological and environmental economics into SEPA's regulatory and strategic planning. So Becky has a lot of experience in bringing the concept of natural capital and ecosystem services into SEPA's work from all sorts of scales, from site-specific regulation right up to thinking about strategic issues about how we manage the natural resources at a Scottish national policy scale. Over to you, Becky.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm here speaking as SEPA. I hope it'll all be all right from a SEPA point of view. Unlike Maura, it was representing no one. But firstly, I want to say that in SEPA we don't use the ecosystem services language anymore. So this slide isn't allowed. But for us in SEPA, ecosystem services are quite simply the benefits that people get from their environment. And working as an economist in SEPA, I need to think about values for the environment quite often, be those monetary or not. And so I like and I use the ecosystem services framework regularly because it ensures that we take comprehensive account of the benefits that the environment can provide. We all know the products, we call them in SEPA, products, functions and processes and cultural experiences. You might refer to them as provisioning, regulating and cultural ecosystem services. For example, the way that we make use of this information in SEPA is that, this is just one example. For the last River Basin Management Plan, we collated information on the provision of all these ecosystem services by all water bodies in Scotland. And we use this information to make decisions. We use this information alongside information about the environmental condition of the water environment to make decisions about, and you can't see because I'm sitting in front of it, about, for example, how to prioritise environmental protection, about whether protecting the environment is worth doing or not. So is it disproportionately costly for this water body to be protected? And we also use ecosystem services to describe environmental damage. So we have to make reports to people. If somebody damages the environment, we have to report on that, for example, to the Procurator Fiscal. And we use ecosystem services to help us come up with values for environmental damage. But I wanted to move forward. So that's the past. And I wanted to think about the future, really. SEPA has got a new statutory purpose, and our statutory purpose in SEPA is to protect and improve the environment, and alongside that, as far as is possible, to provide social, health and well-being benefits, and also to help create sustainable economic growth. This statutory purpose is the statutory purpose for a 21st century Environment Protection Agency. In the past, we've been established to deal with gross pollution and issues like that, and we've done pretty well at that. Gross pollution doesn't happen anymore, but like Alessandro said, we're using if everyone in the world used resources like we do in Scotland, we'd be using 3 planets, not 1 planet. And we need to tackle that gross overuse of natural resources and issues like climate change, and we need a new approach to dealing with that. And ecosystem services are fundamental to that. They're fundamental to thinking about how we can protect and improve the environment while creating economic and social success. CEPA also has a new, in the last couple of months, launched regulatory strategy, which sets out how we're going to regulate in the future. I think I've said everything that I need to say about that specifically, but I would refer you to it because it's a very forward-thinking, new way of thinking about how environmental regulation can be carried out. And finally, we also in CEPA have 6 organisational characteristics that describe who we want to be and the way we want to work to deliver our new statutory purpose. I'm not going to go into all of them now, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. For example, we want to produce information and evidence that people use to make decisions. Environmental information needs to be useful. It needs to be helpful in making economic and social decisions, and CEPA wants it to change people's behaviour. We don't just want it to inform people about what's going on. And ecosystem services and using ecosystem services to describe the environment is a fundamental component of that. But we won't use the ecosystem services language. I also wanted to draw attention to helping communities see the environment as an opportunity. For too long, communities have viewed economic, social and environmental progression as being in conflict. And the world has to change. If we're going to reduce our use of the natural planet, we need to start helping communities see the environment as an asset. And and we need to understand economic and social motivations of communities and work with them to show how environmental enhancement can contribute towards achieving those economic and social objectives. I just wanted to quickly refer to engaging through boardrooms because the environment too often has been as a sideline to business decision making. It's not been an issue that people have considered in the boardrooms, and CEPA would like that to change. If the environment is to become central to the future decision making, and Morag's already talked about how central it is in the Scotch Whisky Association, we need it to be discussed in boardrooms. We need it to impinge upon the main profit-making motivations of big business, and we in CEPA want to be part of those discussions in boardrooms. And for me, ecosystem services is a fundamental component of that direction that we're moving in CEPA, and hopefully across the whole of Scotland, because also we're delivering our outcomes through partnerships and we can't do it on our own. We want to work with other people to get there. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Becky. And finally, to our last but definitely not least speaker, welcome to Bob Costanza. I'm not sure you need much introduction, but I'll do my best. You are the Chair of Public Policy at Crawford School of Public Policy, ANU Canberra, but you have worked in several other organisations throughout the world.
I've been at this for a long time.
Yeah. I was going to say, you've authored over 500 papers. I think it's unfair that we always go back to a seminal paper in 1997, because you've written so broadly about so many different things, but many people may remember when a paper came out with Bob and other authors really trying to put a price on nature, and I'm sure, as Bob will explain, not to make nature a commodity, but to make us think about it in our decision making. I think I'll stop there and let Bob speak for himself. Thank you.
Thanks, and I don't want to take too much time, so we have time for some questions and discussion. Actually, my background is as a systems ecologist, so I've always been interested in looking at the whole system rather than the sort of siloed parts that we tend to in academia. I actually took economics as a foreign language as part of my PhD. So, I'll try to just pick up on a few points maybe that weren't already mentioned, because I think we've got a lot of good background, and I think you're probably in this audience aware of many of these things anyway. One book that I read a few years ago that I thought was quite influential was by Deborah Tannen, called The Argument Culture. And her point was that our current culture is very focused on casting everything as a black and white, right and wrong kind of argument, academia, the law, the media, etc. That works for some issues, but I think for many of the complex issues that we're dealing with, it's really counterproductive to think of these things as black and white, either or. I think that's one of the main challenges that we have to get over, is moving away from the argument culture and more into a sort of transdisciplinary discussion of these complex issues and trying to build consensus on what the solutions to these problems might be. So it's going to take a different way of looking at things, and I think part of the issues that come up with ecosystem services is trying to cast them in that way. Is it ecosystem services approach, or is it the sort of traditional conservation approach? I think that's a problem in itself. It really is not either or, it's really both and. And I tend to take a much more pluralistic approach, and you can look at these systems from many different angles and many different lenses, in fact, many different paradigms as going forward in order to actually solve these complex problems. So that's the first thing. The concept of ecosystem services, I think, is both very old and very new. I think traditional cultures recognize their interdependence with the rest of nature, as I like to put it. And I think we forgot about that and during the Industrial Revolution, when the emphasis was really on the built infrastructure and capturing and using fossil fuels. I think we now live, because of that expansion, in what some have called the whole new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, because of the magnitude of human impact on the planet. But we do live on a finite planet. Who's heard this term, the Anthropocene, before? Almost everyone, probably. Maybe not everyone. But I think it emphasizes the fact that, unlike in the recent or the more distant past, natural capital is now very much a limiting factor in terms of producing human well-being. That wasn't the case really until human population, human impact sort of got to the magnitude that it already is. And I like Kenneth Boulding's conception of our problem as being this is spaceship Earth. It's like living on a spaceship. So it doesn't make sense if you're living on a spaceship to start taking apart the infrastructure of the spaceship. You know that that's going to affect your survival in the end. And I think that's where we are, and that's really what the ecosystem services concept tends to highlight, that we are interdependent with the rest of nature. We can't think of nature as being something separate from humanity any longer either. We are part of nature. We're not apart from it. And so changing that worldview, I think, is essential to our survival going forward. I think the conventional neoclassical economic view was very much the former. It's the economy's here, nature's there. We use nature, parts of nature, for the economy. There's no limits on economic growth, and blah blah blah. All of those things are obviously not true. So we need a much more ecological economics. And I've been working on trying to develop that integration of ecology, economics, sociology. There's much more emphasis these days on how do people actually behave in behavioral economics rather than assuming that they behave as rational utility maximizers. So I think there's been a lot of progress, and I think ecosystem services contribute to that. And so a part of that is trying to understand, well, how much does the sort of natural part of the system contribute to human well-being and the sustainability of that well-being relative to the other components of the system that also contribute. So it's very much of a transdisciplinary science, understanding ecosystem services. It's not just about understanding ecology.
Sorry.
That means I have to stop. It's not just about understanding economics, it's not sociology, it's not the built environment, it's all of those things and how they interact together to produce human well-being now and sustainability into the future. So I think that's our big challenge. And we need to understand how those relative contributions occur and how we can sort of communicate those relative contributions. I think sort of monetary denominator. We need a common denominator in order to do that. Money is just one possible common denominator to express some of those contributions in monetary terms. You can often or sometimes express other contributions in those terms. I want to emphasize that it's simply a way of communicating relative values. These are all about trade-offs, and also to emphasize that it's not something that we can avoid doing, these kinds of evaluations in whatever unit you're do. Every time we make a decision about ecosystems, we are implicitly assigning value to them. We're saying that one thing that we're doing is better than some other conserving a natural ecosystem. That's essentially more valuable in a particular context than other things. So evaluations are happening all the time. It is implicit. It's in our interest to make those valuations more explicit, because often the implicit values are far too low in terms of the real contributions to human well-being. I think it's, in doing this kind of valuation, I think it's very important to take a pluralistic approach. There's no one right way to do this. I think there's room for lots of improvement and research. As I said, we don't really understand human psychology all that well. We don't understand what contributes, although the science of happiness, positive psychology, behavioral economics, we make great strides in better understanding the contributions to human well-being. I think that's a necessary part of it. The other thing that might be worth mentioning is the issue of property rights around ecosystem services, and just to emphasize that most ecosystem services are non-waggle, non-excludable. They don't really fit into the marketable goods and services. They're really outside the market. Should probably stay outside the market. And so attempts to sort of shoehorn ecosystem services into market transactions, and you sometimes hear the term markets for ecosystem services. I think that's really headed often in the wrong direction, not always, but so I think we need some different kinds of institutions that can really acknowledge the fact that these are largely public goods, they need to remain public goods, part of our common assets. And so this idea of common asset trust as an alternative way to manage these systems, I think is something that's both more consistent with traditional ways of managing the commons. There's been a lot of work on that. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics 2 years ago for her work on common asset management and how traditional cultures solve that problem. So and this idea of common asset trust is sort of a modern implementation of many of those kinds of ideas. We've actually suggested that we should create an atmospheric trust. We should think of the atmosphere as being a common asset that we all own together, and that we should start charging the 90 companies that are responsible for 2/3 of carbon emissions for damages to our common asset, and put those charges into a trust that we can then use to accelerate the conversion to renewable energy and sustainability. And so we've all used more than our 5 minutes. And just to say, I guess to end with, I think this concept is already having a major influence. As I mentioned several of the activities that are going on. I think it's really expanding. I think as long as we recognize that this is not an either-or kind of phenomenon, it's not like we have to only use ecosystem services for everything that we do, that we can make a lot more progress and eventually solve our ongoing problem of creating a sustainable and desirable future.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the insights of all of our panel members. Now, lots of people mentioned partnership, and the point of this event is to hear the words of wisdom from our panel, but also to hear from the audience. So I'd like to pass it over to Mark, who's going to chair the question and answer session, and I'll hand over the roving mic to our elders. But what I also will do while I'm doing that, because I'm distracted, is get a glass of water for our speakers.
Excellent.
So I think one of the reasons why I got asked to chair the questions is that we only have 2 mics in this room. There'll be a roving mic for the panel, and there is a small lapel mic that functions as a roving mic for the audience. And I will have to do it with my lecturing voice without a mic. So I might need a glass of water at some point as well. As everyone who's signed up for the event, and not the ones who gate crashed it tonight, they will all know that you were asked to submit a question. So you couldn't register for this event without actually submitting a question to the panel. Now, of those 120 questions that we received, we made a subset. So I have a list of 10 questions here that I think we should be able to get through. And actually, I hope we'll have time for a few ad hoc questions from the audience as well. This does mean, though, that the panel has to be reasonably succinct in their answers to questions, and also that I don't necessarily expect every panel member to contribute to every single question. So we'll see how that goes. The questions that we received really clustered in a couple of main themes, and actually 2 stood out. And maybe they're not so surprising given the topic of tonight's event. But there were quite a few questions around language. So I picked up on a few of those. And then actually the majority of the questions were about different aspects of mainstreaming the concept of ecosystem services to actually use it in practice and to better manage our planet, our resources, and so on. But before going to those 2, I'd like to ask Jessica Boucher to stand up, make herself known. And if the mic could go that way. And Jessica has a good opening question for the panel.
I'm not so sure. Thanks very much. So I think you've already alluded to some of this, so it may not be, like you said, for everyone to answer, but I asked if each of the panel members could give an example of a success and a failure that they have encountered in mainstreaming or implementing the concept of ecosystem services in their various work contexts. So I think it's really important that we share our failures as well as our successes with this, so that we can learn from those.
I sort of asked a very similar question to one of our members this afternoon before I was doing some prep for this one. So again, just sort of looking back, we've got this environmental sector strategy and we've got these key things, and we as the membership see the environment as competitive. And an example in one of our companies where I think it sort of shows the benefits or the balance of natural capital is, you know, for whiskey we need to utilise barley, that's our core material, so I suppose we're therefore consuming some natural capital there. But at the same time we're now moving towards using our byproducts, which is the material at the end of the process, to produce renewable energy. And this renewable energy is going to be on site, and that replaces heavy fuel oil, so you know, that's a positive service. And on top of that, the digestate from this AD plant can go back to land banks and be a fertiliser, so kind of having that whole kind of circular economy loop. And with the AD plant, you're treating this material and utilising it in different ways, so the effluent that goes out from the distillery will change, and the water quality will improve, and you'll increase the capacity of the water environment again. So there's a kind of example that we think broadly sort of taking that environmental system services concept on.
Perhaps an example of where it didn't work, or a failure of the concept.
Perhaps you get first. I'll talk about that.
Okay, so in SEPA we have in the past worked a lot on trying to embed the ecosystem services concept in lots and lots of different work areas, but we have failed quite regularly because it overcomplicates decision making and it doesn't result in better decisions. To be honest, quite often the decisions that we make are pretty good anyway, and we've tried to embed ecosystem services considerations, for example, in our consideration of SEAs, strategic environmental assessment processes, and really we have found internally that it tends to overcomplicate a system that people are already very familiar with. and that works reasonably well already. I'm not saying it's perfect, but quite often using ecosystem services is a bit over the top in practical decision making in SEPA.
Well, so many successes, so few failures. But I think the world is complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons we need to acknowledge that, I think, in many circumstances, and also our uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's one problem. We think our policies are really the answer to the problem and not just an experiment that we're doing with the system. So in general, I think we need to acknowledge that we're taking a much more adaptive management approach. I'm not sure that ecosystem services by themselves head people in that direction, but I think that's something else we need to do. There's lots of examples I could give, but maybe one that might be interesting. Back in 1996, actually, we did a study in South Africa about the Fynbos ecosystems, which is a very unique ecosystem in the southern Cape. And the way we approached that was to get a group of stakeholders together to build a simulation model of how those systems functioned. That included not only the hydrology and the vegetation and fire dynamics, but also the production of various ecosystem services: water, wildflowers, ecotourism, biodiversity, etc. The advantage of that is that you get a diverse group together. Instead of focusing on negotiating their interests, you get them focused on building a model to try to understand the dynamics of this complex system. And that sort of takes them out of their comfort zone, at the same time, I think, allows a much deeper level of consensus building to go on about what's happening there. The parks managers, the issue there was, how much effort should they put into clearing, invasive European pine species that would allow the Fynbos to sort of recover and produce all of these services. And the model was built in a way that sort of allowed some primitive gaming kind of approach. You could adjust the values you attributed to these systems, other uncertainties. You could play with different sliders in the model, and you can see by doing that that no matter what you did, the value of those services far outweighed the cost of doing the clearing. That led to a continuing program now to employ local population to do the clearing of the pine forests, and it's been a very successful program that I think would not have happened really well. It might have happened, but maybe more slowly and with less sort of buying in if we had sort of pointed out all these very complex connections, and many of which you wouldn't necessarily see without understanding the underlying system. So I think going forward with this concept, what's next? I think more of that kind of thing to me would be on the table. And Ida mentioned this idea that we have creating computer games around ecosystem services that would not only allow those complex dynamics to occur, but allow people to begin to educate themselves about how those systems work, by playing the game. They're not going to read scientific papers. They're not going to come to conferences like this. But if you can get people to interact with the system at that sort of game level, they can begin to understand what you're talking about and appreciate it more.
Don't necessarily expect every panel member to contribute to every single question. So we'll see how that goes. The questions that we received will be clustered in a couple of main themes. And actually two stood out. And maybe they're not so surprising given the topic of tonight's event. But there were quite a few questions around language. So I picked up on a few of those. And then actually the majority of the questions were about different aspects of mainstreaming the concept of ecosystem services to actually use it in practice and to better manage our planet, our resources, and so on. But before going to those two, I'd like to ask Jessica Boucher to stand up, make herself known. Before going to those two, I'd like to Mike to go that way. Boucher. Jessica has a good opening question for the panel. Mike could go that way. And Jessica has a good opening question for the panel.
So I think you've already alluded to some of this, so it may not be, like you said, for everyone to answer, but I asked if each of the panel members could give an example of a success and a failure that they have encountered in mainstreaming or implementing the concept of ecosystem services in their various work contexts. So I think it's really important that we share our failures as well as our successes with this, so that we can learn from those.
I
Who
don't
wants to
mind.
go first?
Yeah, I sort of asked a very similar question to one of our members this afternoon for us doing some prep for this one. So again, just sort of linking back, we've got this environmental sector strategy and we've got these key themes, and we as the membership see the environment as non-competitive. And an example in one of our companies where I think it sort of shows the benefits or the balance of natural capital is, you know, for whiskey we need to utilise barley, that's our core material, so I suppose we're therefore consuming some natural capital there. But at the same time we're now moving towards using our byproducts, which is the material at the end of the process, to produce renewable energy. And this renewable energy is going to be on site, and that replaces heavy fuel oil, so you know that's a positive service. And on top of that, the digestate from this AD plant can go back to land banks and be a fertiliser, so kind of having that whole kind of circular economy loop. And with the AD plant, you're treating this material and utilising it in different ways, so the effluent that goes out from the distillery will change, and the water quality will improve, and you'll increase the capacity of the water environment again. So there's a kind of example that we think broadly sort of taking that environmental system services concept on.
Perhaps an example of where it didn't work, or a failure of the
You're
concept.
glad to take it first.
I'll talk about it. Oh, no, go
ahead.
Bob, go first. Somebody.
Okay, so in CEPA, we have in the past worked a lot on trying to embed the ecosystem services concept in lots and lots of different work areas, but we have failed quite regularly because it overcomplicates decision making and it doesn't result in better decisions. To be honest, quite often the decisions that we make are pretty good anyway, and we've tried to embed ecosystem services considerations, for example, in our consideration of SEAs, strategic environmental assessment processes, and really we have found internally that it tends to overcomplicate a system that people are already very familiar with and that works reasonably well already. I'm not saying it's perfect, but quite often using ecosystem services is a bit over the top in practical decision making in CEPA.
Well, so many successes, so few failures. But I think the world is complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons we need to acknowledge that. I think in many circumstances, and also our uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's one problem. We think our policies are really the answer to the problem, and not just an experiment that we're doing with the system. So in general, I think we need to acknowledge that we're taking a much more adaptive management approach. I'm not sure that ecosystem services by themselves head people in that direction, but I think that's something else we need to do. There's lots of examples I could give, but maybe one that might be interesting. Back in 1996, actually, we did a study in South Africa about the Fynbos ecosystems, which are a very unique ecosystem in the southern Cape. And the way we approached that was to get a group of stakeholders together to build a simulation model of how those systems functioned. That included not only the hydrology and the vegetation and the fire dynamics, but also the production of various ecosystem services: water, wildflowers, ecotourism, biodiversity, etc. The advantage of that is that you get a diverse group together. Instead of focusing on negotiating their interests, you get them focused on building a model to try to understand the dynamics of this complex system. And that sort of takes them out of their comfort zone, at the same time, I think allows a much deeper level of consensus building to go on about what's happening there. The parks managers, the issue there was, how much effort should they put into clearing, invasive European pine species that would allow the fynbos to sort of recover and produce all of these services. And the model was built in a way that sort of allowed some some primitive gaming kind of approach. You could adjust the values you attributed to these systems, other uncertainties. You could play with different sliders in the model, and you could see by doing that that no matter what you did, the value of those services far outweighed the cost of doing the clearing. That led to a continuing program now to employ the local population to do the clearing of the pine forests, and it's been a very successful program that I think would not have happened really well. It might have happened, but maybe more slowly and with less sort of buy-in if we hadn't sort of pointed out all of these very complex connections, and many of which you wouldn't necessarily see without understanding the underlying system. So I think going forward with this concept, what's next? I think more of that kind of thing to me would be on the table. And Ida mentioned this idea that we had of creating computer games around ecosystem services that would not only allow those complex dynamics to occur, but allow people to begin to educate themselves about how those systems work, by playing the game. They're not going to read scientific papers. They're not going to come to conferences like this. But if you can get people to interact with the system at that sort of game level, they can begin to understand what you're talking about, and I think appreciate it more.
Yeah, Bruce, do you have an example from the conservation
Sorry
perspective?
for not being concise.
So I'll come at this from my experiences with the World Forum on Natural Capital. I think a real success of the language around natural capital ecosystem services has been the Natural Capital Protocol, which Ada alluded to there. It's a kind of broadly a how-to guide for business, how to implement the natural capital approach through their business. And ecosystem services is obviously key to that. That includes things like the Kering Puma environmental profit and loss account, and it's recently just had Hugo Boss sign up to it. It has numerous multinationals around the world signed up and looking at their impacts and dependencies on natural capital. So I think that's been a real success of the language. Where I think it falls down for me slightly at the moment is maybe a failure of people in my position, making this relatable to people on the ground. Small, medium-sized enterprises in Scotland make up a huge part of the economy, and I think we're a long way off making this relevant to them day to day. We're trying at the moment, but I think we've got work to do there. And looking around how technical we make that language and how relevant we make that to them is very important. I suppose I'm a glass half full kind of person, because even these failures in some areas, it's still got people talking about their impacts and dependencies on the natural world, which I view as a good thing, and it's got it further up the agenda. So I think that's mainly positive from my perspective.
So at that point, can I ask Scott to ask his question?
Read my phone. Hi, I'm Scott Matheson from SEPA, colleague of Becky's. And having heard your talk, Bob, I suspect I know what the answer is in relation to plurality of approaches, but terminology ought not to matter as much as it seems to. But, and I say but again, the emphasis in the business community seems to be moving towards use of the related concept of natural capital. And we have feedback in SEPA from some companies that they're uncomfortable with the terminology of ecosystem services. So, should we be using the language of natural capital rather than ecosystem services in our dealings with businesses that we regulate and that we wish to influence? Does it really matter?
Let's talk about enabling.
Well, that's obviously not an either-or question, or at least it shouldn't be. Natural capital, and is what contributes to producing ecosystem services, and so, I mean, you could argue there are several synonyms that you could use for any of these, and it is a communication tool. So I would argue for using whatever terms seem to communicate best with your audience, but. I think the distinction between the stock and the flow, the stock of capital and the flow of services is one that also needs to be incorporated. It's not an either. It's definitely not an either or. You want to mention that?
Sure. Just talking from a business perspective, we're working on a big project with the National Australian Bank, and they have a tendency to use natural capital. To certain people, and yet they do use ecosystem services to a lot of their stakeholders. So they've had big conferences on ecosystem services with their stakeholders as well. And the project we're doing with them is they're starting with farmers basically, and what they're trying to do is have their farmers manage natural capital environment, their farms better through providing financial incentives. So the way they're doing it is, if let's say a farmer is not degrading their soil, maintaining their soil, keeping the water quality up, etc., their interest rates will be really low. If the farmer is overgrazing or over-fertilizing, totally reducing the water quality, etc., their interest rates will be really high. They might not even be able to get a loan. And the bank is doing that for right or wrong reasons. They're doing it to mitigate their own risk. So in Australia, where they're based, there isn't agricultural insurance. And so the banks provide the insurance for the farmers. So on a good year where there's good amount of sun, average amount of water, all the farmers do pretty equally. However, when there's floods or a drought, which Australia gets all the time, the farmers that are degrading their land, they basically foreclose on the farms. They can't make their bills, and the bank has to then back them up. The farmers that don't degrade their natural capital do okay. And so this is, for the bank, a way to mitigate financial risk by incorporating natural capital into their accounts and into their calculations. And so when they talk to the farmers, some farmers understand ecosystem services, some understand natural capital, some don't understand either. But they understand the concept and understand how the land works. And I think the concept is more important, whatever terms you use. So. Yep.
I mean, having said that, it's neither one or the other, and ecosystem services obviously flow from natural capital. I think that possibly natural capital is slightly more useful if you want to link it to some kind of accountancy framework, especially at the national scale, or also at the national scale. And so if we want to have an idea whether we are actually doing well as a nation or not so well, perhaps incorporating the natural capital into some sort of measure, it is something that can be done probably more easily than looking at ecosystem services, and so having some kind of genuine progress index and so on and so forth. Probably natural capital is a concept that is more easily understood and incorporated.
Okay, so that.
Wait, but keep in mind that the World Bank, when they're working with countries to incorporate natural capital accounts, they're using the concept of ecosystem services to do it through, because ecosystem services are the flow, and a lot of national accounts do incorporate the flow of whatever's going on in the financial system. So that's where the ecosystem services come in.
But it's not either or.
It's not. It's never either or.
It's a matter of communication.
This discussion about where it could be applied leads us nicely into the mainstreaming set of questions. I'd like to ask Sally Thomas to ask her question first, because I know you have to leave a bit earlier.
Thank you, Sally Thomas, Scottish Government. Thanks very much for the presentations. If I can just preface the question, just having heard the presentations, I think a couple of the speakers referred to a view that the concept is kind of spreading out more broadly into different areas. Becky spoke about desire to get in amongst the heads of business and boardrooms, perhaps implying that it's not spreading maybe as broadly as some would like. Speaking from a policy perspective, I find it as a concept, whether ecosystem services or natural capital, which I think are two slightly different things, and perhaps we're in danger of using them interchangeably tonight. In policy terms, it's actually very difficult to get the concept across, to get it picked up, to get it integrated into policy in a meaningful way. So my question really was, how do we make ecosystem services a meaningful concept in a much broader range of areas than currently? Because I think there's a risk that we spend our time preaching to the converted.
Thanks, Sally. I agree with you, but I think that we need to stop talking about ecosystem services and natural capital and really use, well, I mean, you know, to be honest, in academic audiences it's great, and it's a great tool for thinking comprehensively about flows of benefits from the environment. But I really think that with the audiences that we want to change the behaviour of, so businesses businesses, the general public, I don't think that the language is right, and I think we need to talk their language rather than them try and persuade them to talk ours.
What's their language?
Well, their language is benefits from the environment. What benefits do you get from the environment?
Well,
what do you?
That's the definition of ecosystem
Well,
services.
yeah, but it's a different. It's not saying what ecosystem services do you enjoy. It's saying how does the environment benefit you? I mean, it's just purely a language thing.
I agree. I think it is very important, the sort of language that you use, and we have to be really careful we don't turn people off at an early stage, because I think if once you've lost a group of stakeholders, it can be very difficult to re-engage them on an issue. There's a gentleman in the back there, Mike Elm, who runs the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital. He ran a business event last week for at the Institute of Directors in Scotland for a range of businesses, and he sneakily called it resilience in business. Because that's a word that he picked up on. It's very popular in the kind of business environment in Scotland at the moment. In actual fact, we had a discussion about the natural capital protocol and what that could do for businesses in Scotland. But I think it's trying to suck and see what works with audiences, and sometimes we don't get it quite right. And I think we're trying hard to evolve the language to use it. But it all comes back to the core element being based on ecosystem services. I mean, Rebecca's saying they don't use ecosystem services explicitly within SEPA anymore, but you know, it's the concepts still kind of remain at the base of it.
Do we really think it's just about the language, or is it our ability to put over the concept regardless of the language that we're using? It's very easy for us to say, well, it's all about the language. If we just use different words, everybody would get it and understand it. I kind of feel that's a little bit of a get out for those within the profession to say it's all about the language. I think it's a bit deeper than that. There is vocabulary that joins our language every day of the week, you know, and I could give you examples of words that have joined our vocabulary in the last 5 years, and everybody will know what they mean because they use them, because they understand them. And I think it's more about helping that understanding of the concept regardless of the words that we use. And that's really kind of the heart of the question, is how do we get that concept over regardless of the words that we're using?
I'll just very quickly say we've found getting champions with individual sectors in business enormously helpful for that, getting people that will help take it forward, and maybe that's where we've got to begin finding the champions in each sector, and that's what we've found helpful with the Scottish Forum so far.
Paul, I think you wanted to...
Well, I think this partly gets back to my first point about the argument culture, that we tend to try to oversimplify what is really a very complex phenomena. And I think that by the term ecosystem, was originally coined really to recognize that this is not just a passive bunch of resources out there that we can harvest. That it's a complex system, and that's what's providing the benefits and the services. So I think it's what we need to do is really to convince these audiences that these systems are not simple, they're complicated, and we have to take that on board and take it into account. And if you succumb to the pressure to sort of oversimplify these ideas into something that's black and white and easy to make a decision about, then I think we're not really fulfilling the essence of what this concept is about. And that we have to look at the whole system. We can't just look at one piece at a time.
Just sort of building on that, really sort of what Rebecca said, where SEPA's failure was overcomplicating the decision and it doesn't make a better decision at the end of it, and the existing process is reasonably well. I think that's exactly where business are. So, it needs to add value, it needs to deliver something. It can't, so at the moment, a lot of our companies make decisions and investment and they kind of say the word, well, we're just doing the right thing. We know this needs to be done, and it's not got the kind of the detail behind it, but they know that investment in that renewable energy is what we need to do for the the globe, because we can't keep using finite resources. So it's just making those sensible business decisions and doing the right thing, but we just don't have a simple process to put it into the words yet, and it's very, from our perspective, it's still very overcomplicated and doesn't actually add anything.
So that actually segues quite nicely into Tom's question, who's not focusing on a business perspective, but on the land managers.
How can environmental practitioners determine if using payments for ecosystem services is an appropriate policy tool for their needs?
Well, they obviously have to hire some very expensive consultants to tell them the answer to that very complicated question. It depends. I think that's something that depends on the manager. But I think what needs to happen is for better, more easily accessible tools out there to be able to communicate what's going on the land, but in a way that isn't so expensive, but still captures the complexity of the system. So I was mentioning the computer modeling kind of approach, and we have available to us these days, so much more data, so much more computer power, so much more knowledge about how these complex systems function, that I think that the challenge is really getting that into a form that's both credible and reliable, but also not expensive to apply. So that Ida was mentioning the project with the National Australia Bank, and what we're doing for them is something like that, a computer model that could be applied to almost any farm anywhere, that would assess both the dynamics of the system and how that connects with people's well-being and what the ecosystem services are, but that doesn't require a big study each time you do it, or expensive consultants to come in. Something they could use to assess the natural capital on the farms, but also the farmers could use to help do that themselves and understand what would improve their functioning and their value. So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Yeah, I'm slightly worried that I'm going to disagree here with Bob Costanza, but I'm kind of.
You won't be the first.
In relation to PES schemes and payments for ecosystem services, I think we actually do need to simplify quite big time, and we need to focus on very clear ecosystem services that we can clearly attribute to that we can associate with particular buyers and particular sellers. And so I think that where people are doing schemes that are clearly related to carbon sequestration, so woodland planting, peatland restoration, we have got clear mechanisms at the moment, but I think that establishing effective payment for ecosystem services mechanisms does depend upon having clear buyers and sellers and a clear way of describing the product that buyers actually want to buy, and that's why I want to simplify, but Bob's going to come back now.
Simplify is not the right word, I think.
Well, maybe this is simplifying in a way, because I think that the problem there is trying to force the ecosystem services concept into a market formulation. And in order to do that, you have to have, rival excludable goods. You have to have explicit buyers and sellers. You have to be able to measure exactly what it is you're buying and what you're paying for. And I think that's the wrong approach, because these are public goods. It's produced by the whole ecosystem. It's not like one at a time. And so the idea of a common asset trust is, I think, a more appropriate approach. What worked in Costa Rica, I think, is something that actually ends up being more like that. They're not trying to have the beneficiaries and the producers directly negotiating with each other like a normal market. They have a quasi-government agency called FONAFIFO that acts as the trustee. They collect fees for gasoline usage and water usage and ecotourism fees. And then they pay farmers just the opportunity cost. They pay them how much would it take for you to stop raising cattle and start planting trees. So they're using economic incentives, but it's not a market. It's really a trust. They're acting as the trustee for the system. They're trying to rebuild the natural capital, and they're doing it in the most cost-effective way that they know how. So in a sense, that's a simpler system than trying to force a market onto a system that doesn't really work. And I think that's where these PES systems have failed, because the transaction costs become too high. Even with carbon, I think it's also part of the issue. Like you have additionality, you have all these requirements for trying to make carbon sequestration into a marketable good, when in fact it's really a much more complex phenomena that the whole system is doing, and we need to think of that of acting as trustees for that function, and using economic incentives in the most appropriate way to enhance the functioning of the system.
Bruce, you want to say response to that?
I think where the simplicity comes in, I agree with elements of both of that, is really at the land manager's end. If it's not simple to implement, they will not take the opportunity. And as a land manager, the Scottish Wildlife Trust currently doesn't get any money from our approximation of payment for ecosystem services, the Scottish Rural Development Programme, because it's too much hassle for us to do it. We don't have the resource to draw down on it, and think that us as an NGO that would be looking to deliver those broader public benefits would really be keen to take up that money, because we don't have a lot of it. But that's where the complexity for me is the problem. If the land manager can't access the market, basically, then I don't think it's going to work terribly well.
Chris, can I ask you?
Yep.
Oh, sure.
One more on this.
Just one.
I would just quickly to point out that we also need, for payment for ecosystem services to work, I think we also need to have a clear backstopper in terms of what is a minimum standard that we want to implement. Otherwise, we can end up with perverse incentives where I could set up a business of mitigating pollution, essentially, that I produce in the absurd. So there needs to be a clear understanding of what is a minimum standard to meet before we talk about the efficiency of trading, in my opinion.
Hi, my name is Chris Guest. I'm a carbon management student here at the University of Edinburgh. Building on the idea of ecosystem services as a language and a communication tool, should the principle of ecosystem services, however it's defined, be taught in schools? And if so, who should take responsibility for lobbying for its inclusion in sort of national curricula.
Yeah, well, that would be NGOs, I guess. Yeah, so yeah, that is something we advocate. We advocate in our policy there should be more holistic environmental learning. I think something like the curriculum for excellence lends itself perfectly to having a combined module where you might study geography, you might study elements of biology and ecology, and you might even throw in some mathematics in there, and business studies perhaps, and come out with kind of holistic modules. The other thing is our higher education as well. I studied at Scottish Agricultural College as it was then. It's now Scottish Rural Universities and Colleges. There's one compulsory environmental module, I believe, still in first year for agrics, which are the principal land managers, the next generation of land managers across Scotland. I really think in our higher education institutions we need to be teaching engineers, farmers, chemists, the whole lot about our dependencies. Let's not call it natural capital, let's call it the environment, because only then will we really sort of mainstream these issues, I feel, and certainly that's something the Scottish Wildlife Trust tries to push through its advocacy work.
I did environmental chemistry.
There's, for especially younger kids, the concept can be taught in different ways. So I have a friend who is trying to get into every country this idea of 1 tree per child, where every child plants 1 tree every year. And they go on, and there's a whole sort of curriculum that goes with that planting. So they actually go on, that they name the tree, and it's a whole process. And the curriculum they provide with that is meant for anywhere from like a 5-year-old to a 10-year-old or up. So there's different ways of incorporating that into the curriculum at a younger age without using the terms ecosystem services, natural capital, etc. And games, that's a great way to educate, because every kid plays
the
it.
Pokemon Go of ecosystem services. That would do the trick. But I think in general, I think we need a much more of a systems education, starting at a very early age, to recognize that the world is not just a bunch of pieces that don't fit together, that in fact it all interacts, everything's connected, we've forgotten that. And so I think if we could reestablish that, and I think that's what the ecosystem services concept is all about, but it's also one of many systems concepts that we could re-educate people about.
And for our last question, I'd like to ask Kirsty to ask her final question.
Thank you. Chair's prerogative, isn't it? So I was asking the panel if they could reflect on the most relevant or most appropriate policy intervention that might help us realise the vision from the Antwerp Declaration. Can't say that. You know what I'm saying. Just to remind you, the Declaration is about trying to use the ecosystem service framework for a transformative outcome, bringing our attention back to sustainability, bringing our attention back to the idea of value, not just commodities, but value in its broadest sense, and the need for collaboration. So what one thing could be done to make that happen? Sorry, it's probably not one thing, is it?
Probably not.
Yeah. Well, briefly, a natural capital wealth fund for me would be the one thing that I'd like to work towards, which is kind of building on Bob's idea of this sort of fund that everyone pays into if you're having an impact on the environment, natural capital, and that goes to paying for basically solutions, investing in natural capital again.
I suppose this is each of us in turn, is it? I want to agree with Bruce, really, and this isn't SEPA's point of view, this is me speaking personally. If I was speaking as SEPA, I'd probably say our latest new statutory purpose is pretty good. It's talking about economic, social, environmental alongside each other. The guidance mentions ecosystem services in it, so it's pretty good. But thinking really about proper change, I think Bruce's idea is a great one.
God, it seems to be. So I was just going to say the changes in SEPA. Mainly because, just in terms of the Scotch whisky industry are working very closely with SEPA, and the way that they're changing their way they regulate businesses and looking at the decision to be more flexible. So an example would be, instead of just looking at the end of the pipe, to something of the whole system. So don't keep putting tighter and tighter standards on the end of the pipe if the capacity for the water environment is able to deal with those chemicals, the pollutants, because all the energy and cement and chemicals, etc., is go into reducing that standard by that small amount is probably not in balance with the resources needed to, or the benefits you'll get from delivering that standard. So it's that new way of thinking that I think is good.
I think I would say the common asset trust and that idea, as it does look at sort of the whole system, and a lot of people know the idea of trust already from the financial sector, and so I think that communicating down what it means would also be a lot simpler.
More participation and deliberation in decision making, possibly new institution to do that, so that we can take into account both the strictly economic values and also the kind of wider societal values in decision making, both about environment and also all the rest that concerns our well-being.
I agree with that, but I'm going to go along with Bruce and Ida. The common asset trust, which I think can be a vehicle for allowing and encouraging more participation in how we manage these common assets. The state of Vermont has a legislation pending now to create what's called the Vermont Common Asset Trust. So to actually implement these ideas, we have, as I said, proposed an atmospheric trust. And if you go online and look at claimthesky.org, there's an open letter to the V20 countries. So we're trying to get the vulnerable 20 countries, led by Costa Rica, to establish this atmospheric trust, which could then act as an institutional framework to accept payments for damages, but also to use those funds to restore and protect the asset. But I think that idea could be used at many different scales, from watersheds up to whole states and countries, and to the global scale. But the big commons that are still out there as open access resources are the atmosphere and the oceans, and so that would be a good place to start.
Great, thank you very much. On that note, we'll end the Q&A session and continue discussions over wine. I'd like to thank our panel very much for their very good contributions tonight.